The German sergeant laughed when he saw the American prisoner's hands. "Too soft," he said. "Too delicate." These were the hands of a man who cut hair, not a man who cut down enemies. The prisoner said nothing. He just smiled. That silence, that strange, calm confidence should have been the sergeant's first warning. But arrogance is a kind of blindness, and by the time the Germans understood what those gentle hands could do, 30 of them would be dead, and one small barber from Brooklyn would become a legend that even the enemy whispered about in the dark. Before you hear how this impossible story unfolds, hit that subscribe button right now, because you're about to discover the most underrated warrior of World War II. A man whose story was buried for decades because it was simply too unbelievable to be true. This is not your typical war hero tale. This is something different. His name was Vincent Speranza, though back in Brooklyn, everyone just called him Vinny the Barber. He was 21 years old in the summer of 1944, standing 5 feet 7 inches tall with hands trained to hold scissors and razors, not rifles and grenades. His father owned a small barbershop on Flatbush Avenue where Vinny had worked since he was 14. He knew every regular customer by name, knew their kids, knew their problems. He could fade a haircut so smooth, you'd swear it grew that way naturally. The neighborhood boys said Vinny had the steadiest hands in Brooklyn. Hands that never shook, never wavered, never made a mistake. Those hands would soon hold a rifle with the same impossible precision. Vinny enlisted in the army, airborne in January 1944 against his father's wishes. The old man had seen the First War, had lost 2 brothers in the Argonne forest, and he begged his son to stay home, to keep the shop running, to stay alive. But Vinny had heard the stories about what was happening in Europe. He'd seen the newsreels. He'd watched his friends ship out one by one. And there was a girl, a beautiful girl named Marie, who worked at the diner on 4th Street. And Vinny wanted to be the kind of man she could be proud of. He went to basic training at Camp Toccoa in Georgia, where the drill sergeants took one look at his soft barber hands and assumed he'd wash out in a week. They were wrong. Vinny discovered something about himself in those brutal months of training. His hands, trained for precision work, adapted to weapons with startling ease. While other recruits struggled with marksmanship, Vinny could put 5 rounds through the same hole at 100 yards. The same steady control that guided scissors now guided bullets. But it wasn't just his shooting. It was his complete lack of fear response under pressure. Where other men flinched or hesitated, Vinny stayed calm. The psychologists who evaluated the paratroopers flagged him as unusual. His heart rate barely elevated during stress tests. Under simulated combat conditions, his hands never trembled. One doctor wrote in his file that Speranza possessed an almost pathological calm, as if his nervous system simply refused to register danger the way normal people did. They assigned him to the 101st Airborne Division, to a unit that would drop behind enemy lines on D-Day. Vinny wrote to Marie before he shipped out. He told her he'd be home soon. He told her he loved her. He didn't tell her that his unit had a 70% projected casualty rate. He jumped into Normandy on June 6th, 1944, at 2 in the morning. His chute got tangled in a tree and he hung there for 20 minutes, cutting himself free while German machine gun fire stitched through the darkness below him. When he finally dropped to the ground, he landed alone in a flooded field with no idea where his unit was. He could hear fighting in every direction. He had his rifle, his knife, and 60 rounds of ammunition. Most men would have hidden until daylight. Vinny started walking toward the sound of gunfire. He found 3 other paratroopers from different units, all lost, all scared. None of them were from his division. Vinny, despite being the youngest, took command without discussion. There was something about his complete lack of panic that made the others follow him. He led them through hedgerows and across exposed fields, moving toward where he calculated their drop zone should have been. Twice they stumbled into German patrols. Both times, Vinny dropped the lead enemy soldier before the others even registered the threat. By dawn, he'd collected 17 separated paratroopers and guided them back to friendly lines. A captain who barely looked older than Vinny shook his hand and said the barber from Brooklyn had just saved 17 lives before breakfast. But Vinny wasn't keeping score. He was thinking about getting home to Marie. The summer of 1944 was a blur of combat. Vinny fought through the French countryside, through burning villages and shattered farms. He killed his first man on D-Day and his 50th before July ended. He never talked about it, while other soldiers needed to process what they'd done, needed to justify it or rationalize it. Vinny simply accepted it as part of the job. Like cutting hair, he'd say. You don't think about each individual strand. You just do the work. His unit noticed something strange. In firefights, Vinny never took cover the way other men did. He didn't throw himself to the ground or scramble behind walls. He moved deliberately, efficiently, exposing himself to enemy fire in ways that should have gotten him killed. But bullets seemed to miss him. It was as if he could sense their trajectories, could feel them coming and adjust his position by inches. Men started calling him Lucky Vinny. He didn't believe in luck. He believed in precision. By September, the 101st had been pulled back to England to rest and refit. They'd taken heavy casualties. Vinny had been promoted to sergeant. He was writing a letter to Marie when they got the news about the next operation. They were going back in, a place in Holland called Eindhoven. They said it would be easy. They said resistance would be light. Vinny had learned to stop believing in easy. Operation Market Garden launched on September 17th. Vinny jumped with his company, and this time his chute opened perfectly. He landed in a field surrounded by Dutch civilians who cheered and threw flowers. For 3 days, it seemed like the optimists had been right. They took their objectives. They held their positions. The Dutch resistance brought them food and information. Vinny even got his hair cut by a local barber who said he'd never seen an American soldier hold still so perfectly. Then the British tanks that were supposed to link up with them never came. The Germans counterattacked. What was supposed to be a quick victory turned into a desperate battle for survival. Vinny's company got cut off defending a bridge outside Eindhoven. They were down to 32 men holding against an entire German battalion that seemed to have unlimited ammunition and reinforcements. The captain was dead. The lieutenant was dead. Vinny was the ranking sergeant, and suddenly he was in command of men fighting for their lives with dwindling supplies and no hope of relief. He organized a defense that military historians would later study as a masterclass in small unit tactics. He positioned his men to create overlapping fields of fire. He rationed ammunition so precisely that not a single bullet was wasted. He moved between positions, completely exposed to enemy fire, directing his soldiers, adjusting their aim, keeping them calm while mortars fell and machine guns chewed through the walls they sheltered behind. For 3 days and nights, those 32 Americans held that bridge against impossible odds. Vinny barely slept. He barely ate. He was everywhere at once, his presence alone keeping his men from breaking. On the second night, a German squad infiltrated their position. Vinny killed 6 of them in close-quarters combat with a combination of rifle fire and his bayonet. His men found him afterward, covered in blood, reloading his weapon with those same steady Barber hands. On the 4th day, British tanks finally broke through. Of the 32 Americans who'd held that bridge, 14 were still alive. Vinny had personally accounted for 43 confirmed German kills. A British colonel asked him how he'd done it. Vinny just shrugged and said he'd grown up cutting hair in a busy shop. You learn to stay focused when there's a line of people waiting. They pulled the 101st back to France in November. The division was exhausted, under strength, and supposedly going into reserve for the winter. Vinny was looking forward to a hot meal and a real bed. He was still writing letters to Marie, though he'd stopped telling her about the fighting. He wrote about the French countryside, about the Dutch people who'd hidden his men and brought them food, about anything except the war. Then came December 16th. The Germans launched a massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest. American lines collapsed. Entire divisions were overrun. Panic spread through Allied command. Every available unit was rushed to plug the gaps in the line. The 101st Airborne, still recovering, was thrown into trucks and sent racing toward a small Belgian town none of them had ever heard of. The town was called Bastogne. Vinny's company arrived at Bastogne on December 19th. The situation was chaos. Retreating American units streamed through the town, many of them having abandoned their weapons and equipment. German forces were converging from 3 directions. Snow was falling. Temperatures were dropping below 0. The Americans were outnumbered at least 5-1. The 101st's commander, General McAuliffe, established a defensive perimeter around the town. Vinny's company was assigned to hold a section of the eastern approach, a position that intelligence said faced an entire German panzer division. They dug in as best they could in the frozen ground and waited. The siege began on December 12th. German artillery pounded the American positions day and night. Infantry attacks came in waves. Tank columns tried to break through. The Americans held, but barely. Casualties mounted. Ammunition ran low. Food ran out. Medical supplies were exhausted. Men with severe wounds fought alongside men who could barely stand from cold and exhaustion. Vinny was in his element. While chaos reigned around him, he remained perfectly calm. That same unshakable composure he'd had cutting hair in Brooklyn. He moved through his company's position, adjusting fields of fire, redistributing ammunition, encouraging his men. He seemed to know exactly where the next German attack would come from, positioning his soldiers with uncanny accuracy. On the 4th day of the siege, a German patrol captured 3 Americans from another company, including a young private named Tommy Chern, who'd become friends with Vinny. They took them to a bombed-out farmhouse half a mile from the American lines. That night, Vinny volunteered to lead a rescue mission. His captain said it was suicide. The Germans had at least 40 men guarding that position. Vinny said he was going anyway. He took 2 men with him, both volunteers who trusted him absolutely. They crawled through the snow in complete darkness, moving so slowly that the journey took 4 hours. When they reached the farmhouse, Vinny spent 30 minutes studying the German positions, counting sentries, timing their patrol patterns. Then he moved. What happened next would become legend in the 101st Airborne, though for years nobody would quite believe it. Vinny infiltrated the German position alone while his 2 men provided covering fire from a distance. He moved through the darkness like something inhuman, killing sentries silently with his knife, working his way toward the cellar where the Americans were held. The Germans never knew he was there until he'd already freed the prisoners and was leading them out. Then someone raised an alarm. Suddenly, 40 German soldiers were converging on their position. Vinny's 2 covering men opened fire, forcing most of the Germans to take cover, but 8 Germans were too close, blocking the escape route. Vinny told the freed prisoners to run while he held them off. What happened in the next 3 minutes defied belief. Vinny, firing from a standing position in the open, dropped all 8 Germans before they could get off more than a handful of shots. He wasn't taking cover. He wasn't diving for the ground. He was standing there like he was back in Brooklyn. On a lazy Tuesday, like he had all the time in the world, and he killed 8 trained German soldiers with 8 shots while bullets snapped past his head. By the time reinforcements arrived, Vinny had already escaped into the darkness with the rescued prisoners. Back at the American lines, men who'd witnessed it through binoculars were arguing about what they'd seen. Some said it wasn't possible. Some said he must have been wearing a bulletproof vest. Others just shook their heads and said that was Vinny. And Vinny was different. Tommy Chun, the private he had rescued, asked him later how he'd stayed so calm with bullets flying everywhere. Vinny thought about it for a moment and said that when you've spent years holding a straight razor next to someone's throat, guns don't seem that scary. Your hand either shakes or it doesn't. His never did. The siege continued. Christmas came and went. The Americans were starving, freezing, running out of ammunition. German forces completely surrounded Bastogne. On December 22nd, German commanders sent an official demand for surrender. General McAuliffe famously replied with a single word: nuts. The fighting intensified. Vinny's company was down to 16 men holding a section of line that should have required 50. They were taking casualties every day. Food was whatever they could scavenge from dead soldiers. Water was melted snow. Ammunition was so scarce that Vinny ordered his men to only fire when they were certain of a kill. No warning shots. No suppressing. Fire. Every bullet had to count. On December 26th, German forces launched their most serious attempt to break through in Vinny's sector. A full company of Wehrmacht infantry, supported by 2 tanks, attacked his position just before dawn. The 16 Americans had perhaps 300 rounds of ammunition between them, a few grenades, and sheer desperation. Vinny let the Germans come close, closer than any sane commander would risk. He could see their faces in the pre-dawn light, could see their breath fogging in the cold air. He waited until they were 30 yards away before giving the order to fire. His men dropped the first wave with precision shooting. The Germans fell back, regrouped, came again. Again Vinny's men cut them down with impossibly accurate fire. The 2 German tanks rolled forward. The Americans had no anti-tank weapons. Vinny grabbed a dead soldier's backpack full of grenades and ran directly at the lead tank while machine gun fire from its turret chewed up the ground around his feet. He got within 15 feet and hurled 4 grenades in rapid succession. The First three did nothing. The fourth caught the tank's track, disabling it. The tank commander opened his hatch to see what had happened. Vinny shot him. The second tank reversed, its crew apparently deciding that whatever was happening wasn't worth dying for. The German infantry made one more attempt to advance and then broke, retreating in disorder. Vinny's 16 men had held against over 100 attackers and 2 tanks. When the firing stopped, the survivors sat in their foxholes in stunned silence. They'd done the impossible. Again, that afternoon, American tanks from Patton's Third Army finally broke through the German encirclement. The Siege of Bastogne was over. The 101st Airborne had held. Vinny sat in his foxhole, too exhausted to celebrate, and thought about Marie in Brooklyn and whether the barbershop was still standing. His war didn't end at Bastogne. The 101st pushed into Germany itself in early 1945. Vinny fought through the Rhineland, through the ruins of cities that had seemed invincible years before. He was there when the concentration camps were liberated, saw things that would haunt him for the rest of his life, things he would never speak about to anyone, not even Marie. By April 1945, Vinny had been in combat for nearly a year. He'd survived D-Day, Market Garden, and Bastogne. He'd been recommended for the Medal of Honor 3 times, though the paperwork always seemed to get lost or delayed. His service record showed 73 confirmed kills, but everyone knew the real number was much higher. Men in other companies knew his name. Even some German prisoners knew his name. That's when the incident happened that would give this story its title. Vinny's company was clearing a small German town near the Austrian border in late April. Resistance was supposed to be minimal. Most of the German army was collapsing. The war was clearly ending. Everyone was tired and just wanted to go home. They captured a group of 30 German soldiers without a fight. These weren't SS fanatics or hardened Wehrmacht veterans. They were mostly older men and boys, conscripts pulled into the final, desperate defense of a dying regime. One of them, a sergeant who spoke some English, saw Vinny standing guard and made a comment to his men. They laughed. Vinny's German was limited, but he caught the gist. The sergeant had said something about the small American with soft hands, something about how he looked like a shopkeeper, not a soldier. The Germans were mocking his stance, the way he held his rifle, suggesting he'd never fired it, never seen real combat. To them, he looked like exactly what he was, a barber from Brooklyn who had no business carrying a weapon. An American lieutenant who spoke fluent German asked what they'd said. When he translated, the other Americans laughed too. One of them suggested Vinny show them his manicure. It was all good-natured ribbing between exhausted men who'd been fighting too long. But something in Vinny's expression made the laughter die away. He looked at the German sergeant who'd made the comment and said, in clear, slow English, that before the war ended, this man would know his name. The lieutenant translated. The German sergeant smiled dismissively and said something that translated roughly to, "Many have tried to teach me lessons, little barber. I'm still here." The German prisoners were marched to a temporary POW holding area in a school building on the edge of town. Vinny went back to his duties. The incident seemed finished, just another brief moment of tension that meant nothing in the larger scope of the war. Then, that night, everything went wrong. A company of SS troops that intelligence had said didn't exist launched a surprise counterattack. on the town. These were true believers, fanatics who refused to accept that Germany had lost. They hit the American positions at midnight with grenades and machine guns and desperate fury. The POW holding area was lightly guarded, just for Americans. Watching 30 German prisoners in a school basement. When the attack began, the prisoners saw their chance. They overpowered the guards, killed 2 of them, and escaped into the chaos of the firefight. But instead of running away to safety, many of them picked up weapons from dead soldiers and joined the SS attack. Whether they were coerced or willing, whether they thought they could still win or just wanted revenge for their country's defeat, it didn't matter. They were fighting again. The American defensive perimeter collapsed in several places. Units got separated in the darkness. Firefights erupted in streets and buildings throughout the town. It was urban combat at its most brutal and confusing. Vinny's squad was defending a crossroads when they got hit from 3 directions at once. The squad leader went down immediately, then the radio man, then 2 more. Suddenly, Vinny was alone at that intersection with dead and wounded men around him, facing what looked like an entire German platoon advancing through the smoke and darkness. He could have retreated, should have retreated, but the wounded men couldn't move on their own. And Vinny had learned in a barbershop that you don't leave a job half finished. What happened next took less than 10 minutes, but would be talked about in the 101st Airborne for generations. Vinny positioned himself in a doorway that gave him a view of all 3 approach routes to the intersection. He had his rifle, 6 full magazines, and the kind of preternatural calm that most people only experience in dreams. The Germans came in standard infantry assault formation. Vinny started shooting. Each shot was a kill. He fired from different positions, moving constantly but never frantically, creating the illusion of multiple defenders. The Germans took cover, tried to flank, called for support. Vinny adapted too. Every tactic, anticipated every move. His training as a barber had taught him to see patterns, to understand geometry and angles, to work with precision under pressure. All of it translated to this moment. Among the attacking Germans were several of the escaped prisoners, including the sergeant who'd mocked Vinny's soft hands. The sergeant was leading a group trying to flank around the left side. Vinny spotted him in the muzzle flash of someone else's rifle, recognized him even in the chaos. Their eyes met across 50 yards of smoke-filled street. The sergeant raised his weapon. Vinny was faster, much faster. The sergeant went down with a bullet through his chest. The firefight continued. German soldiers kept coming, kept dying. Vinny reloaded smoothly, mechanically, his hands doing the work while his mind calculated trajectories and timing. He was no longer Vinny the barber from Brooklyn. He was a weapon himself, perfectly calibrated, functioning exactly as designed. After 10 minutes, the German attack faltered and broke. Survivors retreated into the darkness. When American reinforcements arrived at the crossroads, they found Vinny sitting against a wall, surrounded by empty magazines, calmly checking over the wounded men he'd protected. Bodies were scattered throughout the intersection. Someone counted them, 30 enemy, dead or dying in Vinny's sector alone. Among them was the German sergeant who'd laughed at his rifle stance. As medics arrived, the sergeant was still alive, barely. An American medic who spoke German tried to help him, but the wounds were too severe. In his final moments, The sergeant asked who the American soldier was who'd shot him. The medic pointed to Vinny. Through the translator, Vinny learned that the dying German wanted to know his name. Vinny looked at him for a long moment, remembered the mocking laughter from earlier, and said simply, "Vincent Speranza, from Brooklyn. I cut hair." The sergeant died a few minutes later. The translator said his final words were an apology, an acknowledgement that he'd been wrong to mock the small American with the steady hands. The counterattack was crushed by dawn. The SS company was destroyed. The escaped prisoners were either recaptured or dead. Vinny's defense at that crossroads had been the crucial point that kept the German attack from breaking through American lines. If he'd retreated, if he'd failed to hold, the entire position might have collapsed. His company commander recommended him for the Medal of Honor. Again this time, the paperwork wouldn't be lost. This time, there were too many witnesses, too much documentation. A colonel personally interviewed Vinny and asked him how he'd managed to kill 30 enemy soldiers by himself. Vinny said they'd made it easy by attacking from predictable directions. The colonel asked if Vinny understood that what he'd done was extraordinary, perhaps unprecedented in modern warfare. Vinny said it felt pretty ordinary to him. The war in Europe ended 8 days later. Vinny was in Germany when news of the surrender came through. He didn't celebrate. He just sat down and wrote a letter to Marie telling her he'd be home soon. He returned to Brooklyn in July 1945. The neighborhood threw him a parade. The mayor gave him a key to the city. Everyone wanted to shake his hand, to buy him drinks, to hear his stories. Vinny smiled politely and said he was just happy to be home. He went back to work in his father's barbershop the next week. The Medal of Honor was presented to him in a ceremony at Fort Hamilton in September 1945. Generals gave speeches about heroism and sacrifice. Photographers took pictures. Vinny accepted the medal with the same calm demeanor he'd shown under fire, shook everyone's hand, and then went back to Brooklyn to cut hair. Marie had waited for him. They were married in October 1945 in a small ceremony at the neighborhood church. Vinny wore his dress uniform. Marie wore her mother's wedding dress. After the reception, someone asked Vinny if he missed the war, missed the action and adrenaline. He looked at his new wife and said he'd found everything he needed right here. For decades, Vinny never talked about what he'd done in the war. Customers at the barbershop knew he'd served, knew he had the Medal of Honor hanging on his wall at home, but he deflected any questions with jokes or changed the subject. He cut hair 6 days a week, raised 3 children, coached Little League baseball, and lived a quiet life that seemed completely ordinary. But the men who'd served with him never forgot. On the 50th anniversary of Bastogne, they held a reunion and tracked Vinny down. They convinced him to speak at a memorial event. Standing in front of veterans and historians, Vinny finally told some of his stories, though he downplayed his own role and emphasized his men's courage. Someone asked him if it was true that he'd killed 30 Germans in a single firefight while defending wounded soldiers. Vinny said the number wasn't important. What mattered was that his men had made it home. A military historian who'd studied small unit actions in World War II later wrote that Vinny's defense of that crossroads represented perhaps the finest example of individual combat effectiveness in the entire war. The precision, the tactical awareness, the absolute composure under pressure, all of it suggested a warrior operating at a level that most soldiers never reach. But Vinny had a different explanation. When asked years later how he'd managed to, Stay calm while facing overwhelming enemy forces. He told a story about his first day working in his father's barbershop. A customer had come in drunk and belligerent, waving a straight razor he'd grabbed from the counter. Vinny's father had calmly walked up to the man, took the razor from his hand, and finished shaving him without saying a word. Afterward, Vinny asked his father how he'd stayed so calm. His father said, "You either trust your hands or you don't. If you trust them, there's nothing to be afraid of." Vincent Speranza cut hair in Brooklyn until he was 78 years old. He died in 2004, surrounded by family, having lived to see grandchildren and great-grandchildren. At his funeral, 7 elderly men in 101st Airborne Berets stood guard. At his casket, one of them was Tommy Chun, the private Vinny had rescued at Bastogne. Through tears, Chun told Vinny's family that he'd spent 60 years trying to find a way to thank the man who'd saved his life. He'd never found adequate words. The barbershop on Flatbush Avenue is still there, though it's under different ownership. Now, there's a small plaque on the wall that says Vincent Speranza worked here before and after serving in World War II. Most people walk past without noticing it. Most people have no idea that the man who used to cut hair in that chair was one of the most lethal soldiers America has ever produced. But in military circles, among students of warfare and combat tactics, Vinny's story is studied as an example of what's possible when precision meets composure under pressure. His ability to maintain that barbershop calm while bullets flew around him, to treat combat like any other skilled trade, represents something profound about the nature of expertise and mastery. The German sergeant who mocked Vinny's rifle stance learnt his name the hard way. So did 30 of his comrades. But the real lesson isn't about killing or warfare or revenge. It's about something more fundamental. The way true mastery transcends context. The way skills developed in peace can be applied in war. The way steady hands remain steady regardless of circumstance. Vinny cut hair for 40 years after the war. Thousands of haircuts, countless satisfied customers, a quiet life of service to his community. He was the same man in the barbershop that he'd been on the battlefield. Calm, precise, unshakable. The only difference was what his steady hands were holding. In the end, that's what makes this story extraordinary. Not the kills or the medals or the heroism, though all of that was real. What makes it extraordinary is that the man who did these impossible things never saw himself as a warrior. He saw himself as a barber from Brooklyn who'd had to do a different job for a while. When that job was done, he came home and picked up his scissors again with the same steady hands that had held a rifle. Some people are born warriors. Some are trained to be warriors. Some are trained to be warriors. And then there was Vincent Speranza, who became a warrior simply by applying the same principles that made him a good barber. Precision, composure, and hands that never shake. The Germans who mocked him learned too late that soft hands and steady hands are not the same thing. That lesson cost 30 of them their lives and changed military history in ways that are still being studied today. Here's the thought that should stay with you. In a world that increasingly values aggression over precision, noise over composure, Vinny's story reminds us that true mastery is quiet. It doesn't need to announce itself or prove anything. It simply does the work, whatever that work might be, with steady hands and an unshakable calm. Whether you're cutting hair or defending a crossroads, the principle remains the same. You either trust your hands or you don't. Vinny trusted his. 30 Germans learned what that trust looked like when applied to warfare. The world would have been better off if they'd learned it while getting a haircut instead.